Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Sabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I am your host, Ashton Sabo. Today, we embark on a journey of learning how to accept life as it is, which is not exactly a small task. This discussion will actually cover two podcasts, so it's a mini-series of sorts. Part one, which we'll dive into this podcast, will follow the story of Nachiketas and Yama from the Katha Upanishad and explore a few key topics in the journey of accepting life as it is, and in particular, our relationship with death. In part two, which we'll delve into in another podcast, we'll explore the story of Shiva and the beggar lady, investigating what it means to surrender to what is. As always, the stories are here to help bridge the gap between knowledge and understanding, to take information and allow it to be digested by the mind, body, and spirit. Now, our first story is an interesting one, as it deals with a topic that's quite estranged from our modern Western culture, and that's death. In cultures like those found in India, death is often front and center. There's a certain intimacy with death. In a city like Varanasi, death is an integral part of the daily experience of life. There's a constant stream of dead bodies being carried to the cremation grounds and to the Ganges River. Death is always on display. And one of the reasons yogis, or tantric yogis, practice in the cremation grounds and ceremonies is to remind them of the temporary nature of embodied living, of living in a human form, the mortality of the body. It's a constant reminder of death. In our culture, in Western culture, we hide death. We hide those who remind us of death. We don't talk about death if someone is sick or old. We even hide our old people away in old age homes. It's typically a very uncomfortable topic for people in the Western world. It's uncomfortable precisely because we never talk about it. But a big reason why it's such an important topic is that our fear of death is an essential and primal aspect of our ego and mind. Most of our fears in life will in some way connect back to this primal fear. So you can address each of the minions of this essential fear, or you can go straight to the source. As an example, let's say you're afraid of heights and afraid of snakes. You might attempt to look at those separately and deal with your fear of heights in one context and your fear of snakes in another. But if we dive deeply into those fears, we'll likely notice that they're stemming from the same primal fear of death. And falling can kill you, a deadly snake bite can kill you, so there is fear. We can spend a lifetime addressing each separate fear that we have, or we can annihilate the source of fear itself. Or you can play the whack-a-mole game with your fears, always striking a new fear as it pops up without ever touching the source, or go to the source of where they pop up from. And that's why death is such an important topic to come to terms with. And it also becomes the foundation for us accepting life as it is. If you're in fear of death or fear of one of its expressions, you won't be able to truly accept life. Right? You're not accepting life at that point. There will be a resistance to what is, so we have to address that first. Now, death is in many ways associated with Shiva. He's often connected to destruction and dissolution, the energy that must destroy and break down something to make room for something else. He's a figure that represents an idea that we must address early on in our journey of awakening. And Shiva represents concepts essential in our path of liberation and understanding. And the story of his will actually be our story for part two of this little mini-series journey we're on for accepting life as it is. But today we're going to be dealing with Yama, the Lord of Death. But a quick footnote. I'm not saying you got to go out and worship some blue-skinned deity named Shiva from a culture different than your own, although that's fine if you want to. What's important is to realize that these characters, these archetypes, what they actually represent, they're symbols that point to a greater truth. And these concepts, these truths exist elsewhere in the world, as well as they come from different images, different archetypes. But diving into many of those is the work of comparative mythologists and kind of beyond our topic for today. Ultimately, we're offering up these stories and characters as guideposts on our own journey. I think this is a good time to come into our story of Nachiketas and Yama, our story about fears, death, and liberation. So once upon a time, in India, sacrificial ceremonies were and are a really big deal. All right, you want a good harvest, there's a ritual sacrifice for that. You want to be married, have kids, want success, want liberation. There are ceremonies for it all. And while there are ceremonies one can do oneself, bigger ceremonies require the presence and participation of the Brahmins, of the priests. And one day, a successful merchant named Vajrashravasa, which is a tongue twister that continuously gets caught in my mouth, Vajrashravasa, and this merchant, he used to perform a very large fire ceremony, a ceremony reserved for serious spiritual aspirants. He was to give up all of his wealth and his possessions and distribute them to the Brahmins and the sages. Because one who could give up all transitory things would be free to realize the truth of reality, the truth of Brahma. And during the ceremony, he begins to offer up his sacrifices. And remember, the whole point is that you're offering up your cherished belongings to the sacrifice. So Vajrashravasa starts offering grains and cows and other things, but as he's offering his sacrifices, his son, his name is Nachiketas, starts to notice that his dad is skimping on his offerings. Right? He's giving up old, lame cows for sacrifice, cows that no longer give milk, subpar grains and offerings. And in a way that children do best, he confronts his father. You seem only willing to sacrifice that which you're ready to sacrifice. Isn't the whole purpose of the sacrifice to offer up that which is most dear to you? Nachiketas says. And the purpose of the ritual is to give up one's cherished belongings. But here is Vajrashravasa holding back, unable to give it all up. And I think most parents can relate to this. We're pressed on time, we got things going on, so maybe we skip corners. Maybe we don't do the best job or the job we know we need to. We're just trying to get it done. And children, with their fresh and innocent eyes, see this much more clearly than we typically do ourselves. The challenging part is that most of us know that we're doing something less than, that we're not giving our best. And yet, strangely, it seems easy for us to get angry and defend what we're doing. And that's basically what Vajrashravasa does. At first, he kind of just dismisses his son in his comments, but Nachiketas keeps pressing him. Right? This isn't a proper offering, he tells his father. Shouldn't you give up what you care about? Aren't you supposed to give up your belongings? Do I not belong to you? Shouldn't you give me up? And finally, Vajrashravasa loses his temper and he yells back, "Fine. You want me to give up my dearest possessions? Then fine. I offer you to Lord Yama, the god of death." Then there's this sort of after effect moment, like what just happened here? Vajrashravasa just gave up his son to death. But being a good son and recognizing his own part in it and his duty to follow his father's wishes, Nachiketas goes to the palace of death, to Lord Yama. But when he gets to the gates of the palace, no one is home. And Yama, death, he's a busy guy. He's always off collecting souls. So Nachiketas sits and waits for him. And he sits and he waits for 3 days. And Yama finally returns and sees that Nachiketas has been waiting. Now, the rules of hospitality are so strong in India that even the gods must obey. And so upon finding out that his guest has been waiting for 3 days, and the rules of hospitality would be such that, like, hey, someone's there, you're supposed to be feeding them and taking care of them. But here he was alone for those 3 days. So Yama decides to offer Nachiketas 3 boons, 3 wishes as a gift, because he wasn't able to offer that hospitality while he was there, or while he wasn't there. And Yama kind of expects that Nachiketas' first wish will be to get his life back. I think that would be the normal response for most people, right? Like you die, you get offered a wish, well, you wish to come back to life. And I can totally understand that. But of course, that's actually not what happens. Nachiketas actually first thinks to his father. Vajrashavasa was pretty devastated by what happened. And as a parent, personally, I can totally relate. Like times when I've lost my temper, lost my center, maybe got frustrated with my daughter, and responding in ways that are less than my best self and feeling remorse afterwards. So Nachiketas' first wish is for the welfare of his father, Vajrashavasa, and for Yama to console him, to make sure that his heart is at ease after what happened, after what went down. And the request surprises Yama, but he happily agrees to do it. And Yama expects now that Nachiketas will ask to be returned to the world of living for his second boon. But no, Nachiketas now asks for the knowledge and understanding of the fire ceremony, for Yama to spill the secrets, the inner workings of the fire sacrifice, which is a big deal. It's like getting a peek behind the curtain. It's like asking an illusionist or a magician to tell the secrets of their craft. This ritual that is supposed to usher in, or can usher in, liberation and truth. Nachiketas wants to know its inner workings. And it's a power not only to affect oneself, but the entire world. It's a big request. But Yama, he agrees. Now, for the last request, Yama totally expects at this point that Nachiketas will finally ask to get his life back. But again, Nachiketas surprises him. He asks Yama to explain death to him. He asks to know all about Yama and the secret of death. And Yama's taken aback. Right? He tries to convince Nachiketas to ask for something else. He's like, no, you don't want that. Wish for gold or children or rule of the kingdom of earth, something that most people ask for. Don't ask for the truth behind death, Yama says. Death, it's not something easy to understand. Even the gods have trouble with it. But Nachiketas keeps pressing. That's his wish, to know the secret of death. What am I to do with these transitory things, he says. All the things you offer will perish. Money, women, gold, family, kingdom, they will all fade away. What good are they to me? What good are possessions if I don't know truth? And finally, seeing the young boy's clarity and determination, Yama agrees to teach Nachiketas all the secrets of death. And possessions are not the purpose of life. In this transitory world, people attempt to find happiness in things that inevitably fade and perish. Therefore, their happiness is in continuous flux. They identify with the world, its objects and emotions, and they think that's who they are. Right? I'm angry. If I'm angry often enough, I start to think of myself as an angry person. If people keep treating me like crap, I might just start to think that I'm crap. Or perhaps I do some nice deeds and help some people out, do some good in the world. And I start thinking, well, hey, I'm a good person. So I stop paying attention to my habits of destruction. My habits that perhaps are not doing good in the world, I'm still identifying with something that is not truly me. I wear a certain style of clothes and maybe identify with those. Who am I without them? Who am I without my car, my iPhone, my stuff? You see, most people spend their whole life identifying with objects. Objects in the world or objects in the mind. And because these things inevitably change form, we are constantly confused about who we really are. And if we don't know who we are, how can we find happiness? Yet the typical path is to try to find happiness out there in the world of things. So Yama says, those who are deluded by possessions and wealth are like children playing with toys. They are bound to get caught up in the snares of death and come back to me again and again. Right? Caught by death, never free to go beyond it. And let's allow for a moment to understand death beyond just the death of the physical body. All right? For me to make a change in life, a part of me has to die, but I must go beyond it to make that change. For a new way of thinking to occur, my old ways of thinking must die. But you see, if I'm attached to my thoughts, my mental stuff, then I'm bound to get caught by death. That is to say, I'll never get past it. I'll never get past my stuff through death and find liberation. Find, in this particular case, new ways of thinking or new ways of operating in the world. And while this can be lofty stuff, it definitely ties back into our original ideas about fear and the fear of death. Our fear of death can also mean fear of losing our identity. It's a death of the identity, or death or fear of losing our ways of doing things or our thoughts. All right? We fear to make changes. Or what will people think? What will they say? What will I do? This is the way that I've known the world. This is how I've acted. Who would I be if not me? And it's this basic fear that has us gripping onto life. And interestingly, being ensnared by death, never free of it. Yama, the Lord of Death, explains two possible paths. One path he calls a good path, and the other path, the pleasure path. One path is going to be difficult, but it will lead you to the knowledge of the highest truth. The other, even though it seems more enjoyable, pleasurable, is ephemeral. It's temporary. Right? When a pleasurable experience passes, and of course it eventually will, then it leaves pain. This is the very nature of the apparent duality of our embodied experience. We see two spots, right? One desirable and one not, and we try desperately to hold on to or reach after the desirable and not fall into the undesirable. What we fail to see is that there are ends, two different ends of the same pole. They are eternally and inevitably linked. And the hope here is that eventually life will continue to give you this lesson until you figure it out. And so, hey, you're still caught on the hamster wheel? Don't worry. Eventually life will get through to you. It'll keep giving you this message over and over and over again until you figure it out. But man, wouldn't it be better to simply make the right choices now, to realize now? The wise choose the good. The ignorant choose the pleasurable. And what the overall theme of the Katha Upanishad, which is where we find the story of Yama and Nachiketas, the overall theme of the Katha Upanishad is offering, or what it is offering, is for us to understand that the real treasure of human life, of all life, the true self, is to be found within. That truth, that which frees us from the snares of death, is not to be found outside of ourselves in the world of things, but inside. The Atman, the soul, the great self, resides within. And once we uncover that truth, then there's no fear of death. Right? We know who we really are. There's no concern about the ephemeral outside world. That doesn't mean you no longer engage it, that you stop living in the world. It instead gives you permission to be in the world, liberated from your fears, immersed in truth. And that's the goal of life, to realize that truth. And then your life becomes an expression of that truth. It becomes a radical life. And look at all the great saints and sages. They're all radical. Even the ones most like us are radical because they live without this fear. And ultimately, of course, they're all like us. But as we get these stories, some seem quite other than us because of the things that they do. But really, it's just because they are so radical. And part of that radical nature comes because they're living without this fear of death. Living from this fear will lead you to seek out the pleasurable, to constantly be grasping for that next peak of the wave, that next high, which of course inevitably leads to the valley, to the low. So instead, look inward, realize truth, and live from the truth, or live from that truth. And that's what this story ultimately wants to tell us. All right, well, that's our podcast for today. I hope you've enjoyed listening. In gratitude, I'd like to read one of our recent reviews on iTunes. This one is from Good Soul. She says, this is, or he or she says, I'm not really sure which because it doesn't give us genders on iTunes, but Good Soul says, This is the podcast I've been waiting for. Thank you so much, Ashton, for your wisdom and spirit. I'm learning so much about what my soul has been wanting to know. I'm a total beginner, and you make me feel like all of your podcasts were meant for me. Well, thank you, good soul, for the kind words. Like I said, iTunes doesn't give your given name, but whoever you are, thank you. I'm glad the podcasts have had such a positive effect on you. We hope you'll keep listening and benefiting from our shows. To all of our listeners out there, please go to iTunes, subscribe, and leave us an honest review. It really helps us out with the show. And as always, thank you, Zach Cooper. He's our wonderful sound engineer for bringing all of these podcasts to life. And thank you, Savannah, for making these podcasts possible. Tune into our next Storytime episode to continue on this mini-series journey of accepting life as it is, as we dive into a story of Shiva. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope you have a blessed and present moment. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.